You're watching Notepad. I'm your host, Ibrahim Sani. The conversation of how this full lockdown is impacting SMEs have been wildly debated and, of course, greatly being debated as well. But we want to understand a little bit more about some of the financial aid that has been given by the government and whether or not it is actually reaching out to the recipients that is intended to do. Today, we've seen how REFSA have said that Pemerkasa Plus is actually a drop in the ocean. They argue that the Malaysian government announcing the stimulus package Pemerkasa Plus in conjunction with the full lockdown or the full MCO, which is not part of how it can help the people, doesn't go far enough in helping those in need. Joining us is the Communications Director of Pemerkasa Plus, Raja Ahmad Iskandar Fareez. Iskandar, thanks for taking the time to speak with us. And for the viewers at home, this interview was actually concocted together in a very short time manner. So again, Iskandar, thanks for pleading to our or pleading to our call for doing this last minute. But yeah, the matter at hand is actually quite crucial, and there's nothing to joke about the matter actually, which is financial aid. Do you feel that this financial aid or stimulus package is not going far enough?
Thank you, Ibrahim. Firstly, it's a communications director for REFSA, not for Pemerkasa.
Oh, pardon. Oh. Yes.
Okay, it's
okay.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so firstly, I'll describe Pemerkasa Plus as like extending a rope too short to reach the drowning victim. So we have a lot of people drowning in this pandemic and the aftershocks of the pandemic, economically, even in terms of health. So Pemerkasa Plus aims to target three areas. One is to increase capacity of our healthcare, and then to boost the social protection of people, the aid and welfare of the people, and also the other one is to give support to businesses. So I think, given this kind of objectives, the 5 billion injection out of the 40 billion total package is insufficient, and you can see it as spreading a bit too thin. If you have this competing interest while having such a little or minute kind of injection, then it's hard for me to see where the effectiveness of this injection can be realized, because okay, we go back to the figure, it's like 5% out of 40 billion. But if you compare that or contrast that to the cost, the economic cost that we could face or could see from this pandemic, it was estimated that around 2.4 billion daily could be the cost for a lockdown, a total lockdown. It's a figure that comes from MOF itself. So if we average that out, or we multiply that by the number of days of lockdown, we could see about around 33 billion economic costs that we could face if we go through a proper total lockdown. That doesn't take into account the follow-up, the phase 2 and phase 3 of the upcoming lockdown for this round. So we see how this figure is not sufficient to counterbalance the economic cost that we are about to face.
Okay, and let's unpack what you just shared just now. The key initiatives that was included in this stimulus package is a 3-month loan moratorium for B40 households and SMEs, an additional one-off assistance for B40 households, and a continuation of the Wage Subsidy Programme. It has to be said that this is not just the only stimulus package that the government has introduced. This is part of the ongoing stimuli that the government has been dishing out since March last year. And it has also been reported widely and extensively that the government is quickly running out of cash. This is not a new thing. It's been happening since the previous administration, from the Pakatan Harapan administration. So now the question is this the best that the government can come up with under the restricted means that they have? do you feel that because of the limitations that the government is facing, this is the best that they can come up with?
So I think what you said there is the core of the problem, or the crux of the problem. We are seeing a government that is thinking or limiting itself, constraining itself to the limited fiscal measure that it has announced repeatedly. So it says that, oh, we don't have the money, we can't afford to spend. But I guess there is no larger understanding that the finances of a government is different than the expenses of a household or an individual. Debt can be good if you use it for economic purposes, to restructure your economy or to kickstart your economy amid a recession. Or in this case, we are facing a pandemic. So it's justified to take more debt to spend in this type of manner. So if we look at this and look at the counterfactual, like if we don't spend enough, what happens to us? I would say today is the result of not spending enough in budget 2021, because budget 2021 was a missed opportunity to usher a new paradigm of economy. But as we see, they didn't spend enough, and now they have to put more, inject more stimulus into the economy to cover up for the lack of spending. And we can repeatedly see this coming into the future, that we'll keep going into lockdowns and then stimulus, lockdowns, and stimulus if we don't have a proper long-term view or horizon in terms of spending plan.
All right. You were mentioning just now that this aid is spread too thin. Do you believe that aid should be more targeted? I have a preface here. Because our GDP contracted by 5.6% last year because of the ongoing pandemic, a decline of 0.5% was registered in the first quarter of this year. It seems like we have to be smart into how we are spending the limited cash that we have. Do you feel that the aid should be more targeted?
So I feel that the government could spend more, and when I say more, I mean it in a more productive manner as well, because if we see the country is now currently at war with an invisible enemy that we cannot see, and to win this war, we need to spend in terms of healthcare, and then to survive the entire onslaught of pandemic of the COVID-19 pandemic is to spend more in the economy to make sure that at the end of the pandemic, everyone still have their livelihood, everyone can still have their life intact, and the economic damages is not too severe that we can't continue on with our livelihood. So these are the considerations that needs to be in the minds of the government. So when I said back earlier that that is not necessarily bad, that can be good. So this is the context where we need to spend more in terms of healthcare. How much more do we need to spend to ensure that our capacity for hospitals and emergency hospitals, or even vaccination centers and testing centers, could be fulfilled? So it's not it's not a matter of how much we spend, it's how much do we need to spend, because these are the factors that we need to consider if we want to stem the infection or the virus spread in the shortest amount of time. If we are neither here or not there, or if we dilly-dally in spending, if we are half-hearted in spending, half-hearted in COVID control measures, unfortunately we are going to see a repeat of what is happening today. We say we're going to go on in a total lockdown, but then a few days later, suddenly the industry started to open here and there, but at the same time, there are no sufficient economic support for the population because of the lack of priority. So I think how
right,
to,
hang on.
yeah.
So REFSA as an institution argues for social advancement, and you do plenty of work in this area. However, the focus that I want to draw upon would be one area, i.e. the SME sector. The SME Association of Malaysia, or SME Malaysia, presented an argument that if a full lockdown is being done, nearly 40% of SMEs will close down their business operations for good if that happens. They said this in middle of May last month, and we've seen how a full lockdown is in place, and that the reports indicate that 91% of SMEs expect business revenues to be affected by this full lockdown. And this has resulted in somewhere between 400,000 to 500,000 workers at risk. Do you feel that these kind of targeted assistance can be, should have been done to help this group of employees as well as the 40% of SMEs?
I think the tools are there and it should work, but the quantum is not sufficient. Like the wage subsidy, I don't think 500 per worker would be sufficient to keep any businesses afloat. And the cash aids that that comes to support of these B40 workers or those earning at a certain level, I don't think it's sufficient to ensure that they can survive this total lockdown. On top of that, I think a question also needs to be asked to the how do we manage the total lockdown and how do we ensure that these businesses can open up safely after the total lockdown? Because we see the SOPs that are being implemented. There's no, I think, detailing out of, okay, how does the SOPs manage or govern the daily operations without curbing, without spreading COVID-19. So in terms of, let's say, one employee is infected, how can the workplace protocol prevent from an outbreak to happen? Because we see researchers coming out that transmission can be carried out through airborne vessels.
SOP efficacy is while related to the context of this conversation, it is not central to it. Now, my central argument is this. The 5 billion headline figure is underwhelming, according to some economists. REFSA themselves are saying, you guys are saying that it is a drop in the ocean. My argument is, if this is the case, then what should be the way forward? I'll give you some ideas here. The critical fiscal measure to whether the lockdown make up only 12.5% of Pemerkasa Plus's monetary value, according to your study. And you also argue that this is including a measly healthcare spending of 1 billion ringgit, cash transfers to B40 households at 2.1 billion ringgit, subsidies affecting employees at 1.5 billion ringgit. These are the net sum. But when you say things like 500 ringgit, which employees down to the individual is not enough, that highlights the problem. To me, I get 500 ringgit wage subsidy is not enough, but it comes at a total bill of 1.5 billion ringgit. It's a lot. Are we trapped in this circular argument where nothing much can be done other than just managing, putting out the fires rather than truly able to come up with a stimulus package that truly helps people out?
I think that's where it comes back to the piecemeal manner of the execution I said earlier in this conversation. Even before going into lockdown, I think this kind of potential challenges should have been identified earlier, and the upcoming solution have to be identified even earlier on. We are like 1 year into the pandemic, 1 year plus into the pandemic, and this is not our first lockdown. So I think that the willingness to spend, there is room to spend, there are room to spend, and the willingness needs to come with it. If there is no spending, then it shouldn't if the government is not willing to spend, then a lockdown might not be the most effective tool to manage this pandemic, because we are seeing the government going into the lives versus livelihood false argument, because both are important, and it's not just about lives and livelihood today. It's also about lives and livelihood after the pandemic or after the lockdown. If we don't
Yeah.
manage it now correctly, some people might not have livelihood or lives beyond the lockdown.
Okay. We'll go for a short break. When we come back, we'll continue our conversation with Raja Ahmad Iskandar Fareez of REFSA.
Thank you.
Thanks for staying on with us. I have with me Raja Ahmad Iskandar Fareez, the Communications Director of REFSA, or the Research for Social Advancement. Iskandar, I got your name and job title right this time around. Apologies for the earlier part.
Okay.
But this is another argument that I want to take forward, not just about Pemerkasa Plus, but what REFSA has been arguing for quite a bit now, which is on trying to see whether or not there is a ceiling that we can raise, trying to understand the government spending concept, not overstating the fiscal burden on state coffers, or even to that matter, exploiting the powers of the emergency. I don't want to get into that argument just yet, but since we already are in the emergency, is this the time for the government to actually spend big, so to speak, go big or go home, or else what's the point of doing an emergency? What are your general thoughts on this?
So I guess my thoughts on this is like, if now is not the time, when is? We are in a pandemic, and the government itself acknowledged that we are in an emergency. So there is no better time to spend than today. And in fact, I think no better time to spend than yesterday, because it should have been done earlier. But I think the question in all of our minds is like, how can we come up to that figure of spending? How much spending is enough or should be spent in this current scenario? For that matter, I think we cannot run away from the topic of convening parliament. That is an integral manner in managing the pandemic, because that we had to acknowledge that the government or no individual knows everything. We need a cohesive, collaborative manner of dealing with the pandemic. So having experts, having politicians from both sides adjourn to discuss about the pandemic, what is needed, what needs to be spent on, how much money needs to go into the economy, how much money needs to go into business, how much money needs to go into the education sector, how much money needs to go into the healthcare sector. These are all the sectors critical to the pandemic and vastly affected by the pandemic. So without that conversation happening, it's hard to come up with a spending plan that can cover this gamut of issues.
Do you feel that it cannot be overstated into how the lack of oversight by the check and balances powers that we have, i.e. the parliament or some other check and balances procedure that we have, this is affecting how we are actually creating policies for the people? This idea of it's an emergency, I have to do what is needed, and therefore check and balances are not needed. This type of approach is no longer, I guess, feasible.
Yes, as I said, the era of government knows best is over. So check and balance is very much needed, especially in this climate of pandemic and emergency, because a step in the wrong direction could be costly, and in this instance, it could cost lives, not just jobs or whatever. It costs lives. Daily, we see around 200 lives are lost from the pandemic. So if we don't have a congregation of ideas, a discussion of ideas, a check and balance on how we should move forward, then one man's folly could cost an entire nation. So just to give an example on how we could have managed things better, let's say the immunization program. So we need to ask questions. Are we vaccinating the population at the right pace? Are we vaccinating fast enough? is this the most efficient way to roll out the vaccine? From the rollout, are the most vulnerable segment of society getting enough protection from the vaccine? Because there are issues, as people understand, stemming out from the rollout of vaccines. So these are the issues that the lawmakers, the policymakers can't actually debate on because parliament is not in session. And I think even the mass population don't have the avenue to voice out concerns, because we also hear those people who have registered for their vaccinations and then have their appointment changed the day before the vaccination. So all these matters erodes confidence in our pandemic management approach. So,
Okay.
And summing it up, democracy is not shouldn't be turned off during an emergency.
All right. One more item that I want to touch upon regarding this whole idea of lockdown is perhaps to ask you about where you think the direction is going to be in the near term. How do you think this will pan out, in your opinion?
So, Ibrahim, I think if we don't have a cohesive or coherent plan ahead, and we don't learn from our mistakes in the past, our experience in the past, and also experiences from other countries that have either tackled the pandemic successfully or dealt it even worse. So if we don't take this learning and carry it forward into our action plan or a kind of a way to deal with the pandemic in the future, I'm afraid that we could be extending the amount, the length of crisis mode that we are living in today. So if we don't arrest the measures immediately, if we don't learn immediately from these follies and from these drawbacks of the past, we might repeat the same mistake and prolong the COVID era that we are living in. One example I can highlight is the way we are dealing with migrants, the undocumented migrants. Last year, in the middle of the year, we went into a punitive approach to crack down on migrants. What happened after 1 year? We are still doing that with a recent announcement by the Home Ministry. So what effect does that have, or what impact does that have to our pandemic management? These migrants who could carry COVID infections will run away from authorities and hide in the society. And these invisible communities can spread COVID without us knowing. That happened last year when it triggered the third wave. It will happen again this year if we don't learn from our mistakes.
Pushing back to what we can do, right? Other than having this nice conversation in the comforts of our home, that's one way of doing it. But where do you think the role of the many of us should be when it comes to looking at how things are being done here, and perhaps trying to see how we can better it ourselves? What do you think we can take it upon ourselves and get it done?
I would iterate what we always say from REFSA, that for the COVID pandemic to end, we need a whole of society approach. So it comes from the government and it comes from the many segments of society as well. But there's no running away from touching the idea of transparency and also accessibility. If we have the government call for parliament to have session, then they can actually govern through select committees to address any challenges that comes with the pandemic. So these select committees can actually have experts from outside to contribute. So citizens like us who have ideas can actually can be consulted to address any problems that stems from the pandemic. So it's not just the government doing their work, it's an idea that comes from the society as well, and also coordination and collaboration can be intensified in terms of, let's say, vaccination centers. It doesn't need to be a mega vaccination center. It can be a local community vaccination center with the cooperation of the local community, opening up the Dewan Serbaguna, turn it into a vaccine center, turning the Dewan Masyarakat into a drive-through vaccination center, or turning those areas or premises into testing centers. So to increase the testing capacity, for us to detect any invisible contraction of the virus within the community. So these are the many different areas where the society can come in, but it needs a proper and clear leadership from the above so that we don't waste our resources doing the same thing and recreating the same wheel.
Fantastic. Thanks, Iskandar.
Thank you, Ibrahim.
But again, thanks again for taking the time to speak with us. That was Raja Ahmad Iskandar Fareez, the Communications Director of REFSA, or the Research for Social Advancement. If you've missed any part of this interview, just head on to astroawani.com. There's plenty of resources that can be found there. Just look for Notepad or search for COVID-19 or even REFSA. And if you've missed or if you want to keep abreast with all the kind of news regarding COVID, just stay on with us at channel 501 Astro AWANI. Until then, thanks very much for watching and goodbye.